You know, what you take away from a painting may be just as important as what you add. Yeah, I said it. Deal with it. Going back to the mind of watercolor, everybody. Well, today we're going to talk about lifting or removing paint. Now, this is a very important technique to learn. You're going to at some point need to remove paint. Most likely it's because of highlighting. It can be done at different stages, and there's a number of ways you can do it. But before we do that, say hello to my buddy Reese. Still rocking the shades, eh? He's just being stubborn because I told him he didn't need them. So in traditional transparent watercolor, white is your paper. You don't paint with white. Basically, you leave the highlights. You plan around the paper so that highlights are either masked or painted around. However, you can't always plan for every single highlight, every single white, the amount of white. In other words, you may have painted something and you want it to be a little brighter than what you painted it. Inevitably, you're going to need to get into lifting. Not only are you going to use lifting for highlighting and adjusting values, you'll use it for things like softening edges and even the occasional correction. Not me. I'm perfect, right? Oh, shut up. All right, so first of all, let's start out with you're painting along. You want to lift while you're painting, and this is the most common way. Basically, you're painting common rock. All right. Basically, you take the brush that you're using and you dry it out very thoroughly. A dry or nearly dry brush will pick water and pigment up almost like a sponge. And you can see how I'm pulling out highlights. And not only does that create a highlight, nice little highlight, but it stops the flow of water. It's because the water is still damp or the paint is still damp that I'm able to do that. And I can actually start modeling the highlights on this rock. And this is the most natural way to do it. When this dries, this will look the most natural. So the way to practice this is just start painting. Just paint some amorphous shapes like some rocks. Thoroughly dry. You can use a paper towel if you want. It doesn't have to be. I use an old hand towel, but the point is to squeeze out to as dry as a brush as you can get. Now, once the paint dries, obviously you're not getting much. It only works while the paint's very wet. Now I've lifted out some very nice little highlights. Now I could paint around that to begin with, but sometimes, you know, it's more intuitive to actually lift out where the highlights are. But if you're painting bigger shapes, and I want to make a bigger shape here, we'll go to the second technique for lifting while you're painting, and that's blotting. Now, in this case, I'm just using a tissue. Got light coming from this way, so let's say I want to throw in some highlights. Very similar to scraping, if you're familiar with scraping. I don't do scraping. It's not a technique I'm very comfortable with. A lot of watercolorists do use scraping and do a very good job at it. It's a legit technique. You have to get the paint while it's wet and before it soaks in and starts drying. Let me show you another really common use of blotting or lifting. Now I look at that and I say, okay, I want to get some clouds in there. Some nice fluffy white kind of cumulonimbus clouds. Again, same tissue. In this case, I'm pressing pretty hard. Okay. And where that has dried, that's stopped that water movement. Not only has it lifted the paint, but it's created a hard edge. When you start drying the surface, the water stops moving. I can even go in now in that same wet and wet area and darken that, and that paint's going to come up to those edges and it's going to stop. This could continue to spread in the wetter areas. So if I wanted to feather this color up into the cloud from the bottom, I can do that with a dry brush. So with blotting and drying your brush, there's a lot you can do while you're actually painting to lift. Very important technique, and one you will use a lot. Alright, so how does lifting work once the paint is dry? And I think this is probably one of the most exciting aspects of watercolor if you do it right. Now, the proviso I have here is that it's a very easy technique to overdo and make your piece look overworked. So you want to be careful. You want to do it in a limited fashion. Papers differ in the amount of sizing, so some lifting is going to be easier and more successful on certain papers and less successful on others. Either way, you want a very good quality paper. Again, that's the one thing I harp on, but it's really true, especially when you get into the more abrasive forms of lifting, which I'll be showing you in a few minutes. So let's start with, again, a standard brush. And this would be the most gentle. And by the way, I'm going to go from the gentlest to the most aggressive forms of lifting. You paint the area that you're going to lift. And I'm just going to do stripes across this blue so you can get a comparison. But you want the water to penetrate and loosen up the already wet, or excuse me, the already dry paint. And as it lifts it up, then you dry your brush and go back and lift that pigment. And you go back and forth. Okay, I'm adding more water. You can do this with smaller brushes if you're trying to do it in a more detailed area. And when you use a standard watercolor brush, because they're soft brushes, your highlight and lifting is going to be fairly soft. And most lifting in general has a kind of a soft edge quality. Again, I'm going to wet my brush again. I'm going to wet that area. I'm going to dry out my brush real well, and I'm going to lift. Wick that moisture back up, and pigment comes with it. The next level, and this is probably my favorite, are bristle brushes. Bristle brushes are typically used for oil painting or acrylic painting. They're not usually used for watercolor, except in this case. Bristle brushes make an excellent lifter and gentle scrubber. When you get into scrubbing, you're actually scrubbing the fibers on the surface of the paper. So let's try a bristle brush. Again, I have thoroughly wet the bristle brush, and I'm going to paint water into the dry pigment. Because bristle brushes are stiff, they give you a little more scrubbing action. Then I start the process of drying the brush tip, which then allows me to lift the moisture and some of the pigment with it. But where it excels is I can get a little more detail, and then when it comes down to stubborn colors, I can start scrubbing. If I go back and forth and back and forth, you can see I am able to get a little bit brighter. This is a thinner line, but I'm able to get a little bit brighter line. And you can, I don't know if you can see it if I'm close enough. I'm starting to peel back some of the paper fibers. And you should be able to see that's a brighter, more precise line than that. And that's what's good about bristle brushes. All right, the next level are called scrubbers. It is also a bristle brush, but it's extremely stiff, like a toothbrush. So these have almost no give at all. It's like wire. It's like nylon wires. Well, this is a much more abrasive form of lifting, but you do it the same way. You wet the brush, get water down. You can even dab it if you don't want to do too much scrubbing right off the bat. Scrubbers come in different sizes. I get this little tiny detail one here. But very stiff, very abrasive. Same technique, dry it out, go back in, lift. But you can see I'm getting to the white of the paper much faster. Right now I've already got it to the point of a standard brush, but we're going to take it a lot further. We're going to do what it was intended to do and actually scrub the paper. You do this lightly and gently. Again, something you want to use in limited amounts, but you can see in the progression from how much pigment is coming up. This is getting the most. Now, just as a special effects thing, I'm going to show you two other things that are used that I would classify as lifting. One is scraping with a craft knife or an X-Acto type knife. And this is good for fine lines, like branches or grass, or even if you want to scratch a little highlight on the tip of something. But it only works well for those fine details. Again, not something that you want to get carried away with. And here's another special effects one, sandpaper. Now I primarily only use this for highlights on water because it looks like sparkles, you know, along the water. Let me show you. Difficult to see there, and I may have paper that's a little too fine. If you get really coarse paper, you'll get more of a fleckled, speckled look, but it produces a very scratchy look that could be used in a number of ways to create texture, I suppose. Suppose you have a flat sphere like this. Let me show you how I would model that using lifting. Now, in a real situation, I would paint that sphere as modeled as I could get it and then just go up, touch up the highlights. But as an extreme example, we'll do all the modeling with lifting. And I'll show you how I would do that. First of all, using a standard watercolor brush, I'm going to go in here and just flood the whole thing with water. I'm just going to loosen the whole thing up. Next, I'm going to blot up on the upper edge. So I'm going to do it again in a more limited area now. And you can see I'm getting some pigment there. This is definitely a higher staining color. Now I'm going to scrub or work it a little bit with the standard brush. Again, I like to start with the most gentle forms and work down to the more aggressive, more abrasive forms. Go again. Sometimes it takes patience. It takes a while. I'm working as though my light's coming from this direction, so you know what I'm modeling for. So I'm working towards a three-dimensional sphere look. Okay, blot it completely dry. Now let's move to the bristle brush. And I'm going to more localize the highlight now because I want it to be hot right in this area. And it will get you out of jams sometime, these highlighting techniques. You know, because you forgot to leave a highlighter, you forgot to do something, or you made something too dark. Now, stage 3. You don't have to go through all these stages, but I'm just showing you again, just as I did over here, the stages. So we'll make a hot, super hot highlighter right there by scrubbing that back to almost white. And voila! Well, there you have it. That's lifting. Very essential technique, used in limited amounts, but very important. In fact, I'm going to add that to my basics, Watercolor Basics playlist, because it is such an important technique. I hope you'll try it. I hope if you have some lifting techniques that I didn't mention that you like, put them down in the comments and we'll talk about them. Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate you tuning in. If this was a help to you, I hope you'll like the video. Subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of content, and we'll see you next time.